بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الجليل الكريم الممين الحكيم الولي الوهاب الحفيظ الصمد الحق السلام. Juma Mubarak, peace be upon you. Today we're going to have a shorter talk. It's an introduction to Zaydiism, the Zaydi madhab of Shia Islam, which I, at this time, only have a cursory knowledge that is somewhat intersectional to other sectarian musings. So we're going to do a part two later on as I've learned more. The telos, the meta, the objective of my theosophical project is not just academic or mystical, but rather there's a specific objective, which is dawah. I want to design a package, a program of dawah that will be more successful than any that has come before. And I want to teach it to others, not just to promote my own platform, but to promote a diplomatic way of understanding Islam that helps bring in the maximum amount of people in you might say, multi-level marketing. And when we study Zaydiism, this is particularly interesting because in our Western concept of morality, well, it's not really Western, in our modern concept of morality, things like child marriage being mandated by God, and that you could have divine command overlap with moral anti-realism, and that you have to retreat from arguing that God wants us to follow objective morality of submission to God, and that there's wisdom in God's rules. But then you say, but this hadith is true, and it was a different time, so they retreat into moral relativism. And this is a whole episode, the Aisha thing. So then Shia Islam does not teach that, and there's almost 200 million Shia in the world. So a lot of people, not the majority, but 20%, let's say, of converts to Islam who don't end up on the Quran only track, like we've seen with our brother Grayson recently, mashallah. That's been fun. There is this sense of meaning that is universal and not prophet specific in the Quran that resonates with people, and then they find Sunni Islam odd for that reason. But people who vibe with the idea of a sunnah and the idea of a particular wisdom in this iteration of monotheism, but they reject the moral anti-realism, or often as well the situation in Gaza and how the Sunni countries are not really proactive in defending the Palestinians. It's Iran and Hezbollah and the Ansar Allah, the Shias, who are fighting for the Israelis and getting their eyes taken out by explosive pagers and other dangers. These are the ones. So people become interested in Shiism for that reason. So either through desiring a more and also the predestination doctrine is intellectually anathema. So then people come to Shiism, but then there's some things in Shiism that are also problematic. Iran is not a model of a perfect society in the way they treat their people and in their foreign policy. Um, the doctrine of the 12th Imam being an occultation might not seem plausible to a lot of people. Also, Adnan Rashid, in his rhetorical style of verbally bulldozing, there's a clip of him at Speaker's Corner arguing with the Shia, and he's correctly citing that they mostly take their hadith from Jafar, they don't really take very much from Ali, Hussein, and Hassan, or the later six imams, which demarcate their religion. Now, rather, they're madhab. We're all Muslims here. Inshallah, we will be unified in Tawheed. But and I need to study the Thalakin website and really get a sense of the different hadiths from different imams and get a flavor for them. And then there's also what's nice about the Twelver school, besides the Mutazili Akida, is they are open to rejecting or being skeptical of hadith. So if there's a hadith from Imam Ali, such as women being hung by their hair as seen on the Mirage, and therefore the hijab is really important. Well, what about the murders? What about the adulterers? What about the thieves? Why weren't they in the vision? Why is it a hijab? Why is it so specific to this one thing? So there's room for progressive Shia and pushing back on some of these things. And yet the Shia, the Quranists would generally dislike the Shia, and they tend not to know a lot about them, and they tend to assume that they're also, mushriks. This slur against the majority of Muslims for recognizing what they believe to be sanctioned symbols of God's guidance, and that Quranists reject these as being sanctioned, so that they say it's shirk, but they don't believe it's shirk. I mean, it's the same thing with Christians and the Trinity, but less so, less ontologically assertive. Um, but they also will say that that the Imam is the Hujjah upon which the cosmos rests, right? And then you have the Ishmailis, who are less conservative than the Usulified Twelvers, and they have a living Imam. But the downside of a living Imam is that you can take paparazzi photos of him with a younger woman on a yacht, and so on, right? So then we have the Zaydi school, and the Zaydi school says, well, we just follow the first few imams, and we don't really necessitate this magical infallibility on a specific lineage. Rather, there are many lineages. They supported, of course, Zayd, who was, I believe, one of the sons of uh, Hussein, alayhi salam, if I'm not mistaken. And of course, like many of these rebellions, it failed, and so they split off. And so you'll find a trickle of Western converts who choose to identify as Zaydi because it gives them the benefits of the Mutazili Akida and Shiism and the more intellectually robust Usul without all of the trappings of Twelverism, or for that matter, Ishmaelism, such as belief in reincarnation, hardcore perennialism, more liberal usul. And indeed, the Zaydi jurisprudence can be quite conservative, as we see, and there's room for a spectrum of interpretations there. So if you look at the Houthis, they have become progressively more conservative since they came to power and since their power has solidified in Sana'a region of Yemen. They've closed women-owned gyms, so women would work out all women environment. No, this is not acceptable. They have allowed widows to go without the means of earning income out of over precaution against women being seen in public, apparently without a mahram. And this is not correct. And I don't even want to mince words about interpretation. This is injustice. And the Houthis have not been good to their non-Zaydi Yemenis. And it's not even with the Houthi thing. It's not even a question of Zaydiya, because Saleh was a Zaydi, but he was considered a munafiq for being collaborator with the regional power of the Saudi, armed with U.S. sold weapons, of course. This is how the world works these days. And whereas there's a sense of Islam in the other schools of Shiism, and the Sunnis spread that to a lighter Isma for all of the Sahaba, which is problematic because that's a lot of people. So somebody's going to be doing some major sins and all of that. And for lineages of specific imams, this becomes also a dogma. And for a lot of us, there's a skepticism that anyone but God can be truly infallible. It's the same reason why Protestants don't value the Pope, or even Eastern Orthodox for that reason, for that matter. And in Zaydiism, the doctrine of Isma is a bit softer. That they weren't incapable. It's not that they were incapable of saying anything incorrect. So we get away from some of the Hadith dogmatism, but that they were capable of sinning and were consistently good at choosing not to. So this is a bit more of a this is a smaller pill to swallow. And they have their Hadith traditions narrated by the first few Imams. And for those who are steeped in Hadith criticism, not just from a reactionary, reject all Hadith sort of Qurani perspective, but within the academic purview of modern Hadith science, um, or if you're familiar with New Testament studies, biblical studies in general, the historical accounting of any documents from late antiquity and the early medieval period is extremely problematic. So, whereas I would be more inclined to accept the validity, the preservation of hadiths from the Abbasid period, from some of the late Twelver Imams, or for example, Hassan of Alamut in the Ismaili lineage. And I would certainly accept quotes from Aga Khan III from the late 1800s. Um, I'm skeptical of any hadiths attributed to Imam Ali and Hussein and Hassan for the same reason that I would be of the torrent of prophetic hadiths or Sahabi hadiths that came out in those centuries. And they have an account of Abu Hanifa coming and sitting down with Imam Jafar. So this is another mythic Jafar and Hanifa interaction. And Abu Hanifa asks if he can sit down next to him, and he says, "You're famous. I don't want to sit next. I don't want to sit next to you." And then he sits down anyway, and he says, "Well, hey, I heard in Kufa that they take your word as like the word of God." And Jafar says, "Well, they don't. I told them not to, but they don't obey me, just like you didn't obey me just now." So this is a Zaydi hadith used to discredit the what seems to be a pivotal extension of Jafari fiqh as the unifying thread in Ismaili and Imami or Twelver or Ithna Ashari Shiism. And of course, in the Ismaili tradition, they abrogate that fiqh with later Imams. That's like Windows Update. And mashallah, God provides us with new window. Maybe you don't like the new Windows. Maybe you don't want to upgrade to Windows 11. Well, then 12verism maybe is for you. Windows 10 is it until Judgment Day when the Maddie comes back and brings us, Windows 19 or whatever, right? And and with Zaydiism, they're like, XP is pretty good, and we're sticking with XP. And if there's no more support for it, well, then we'll end up like what the Taliban, the Deobandis did to the Hanafi madhab funnily enough. So the Twelvers and Ishmailis that I hang out with in this Bettini group chat that I not just lurk in, but I actually sometimes stir the pot a little bit. They generally think of the Zaydis as Sunni collaborators and Nasibis, they call them. Nasibis are like the opposite of Rafidi. So there's a place in Persia called Nasibis, and so this became coined as a bastion of anti-Ali hate speech. And it's all very sad. I think that the real optimistic project, and what's going to also not only help the Muslim world but help bring more people into Islam and keep them in Islam, is a general appreciation of diversity in the Deen, and that people can pick a school, and there are more than four. You can pick the four Sunni schools, the Zahiri school, the Zaydi school, the Jafari school. They don't recognize the Ismailis because of the doctrine of Qiyamah, resetting things and then modifying the fiqh. They think that's beyond the pale. They treat that like they treat the Ahmadis. So we're at a point now. We had the Amman Accord 19 years ago, in which 8 schools, the Abadi, Zaidi, Jafari, and Zahiri, and the four more commonly known Sunni schools, were identified as being legitimate. And that was a little while ago. So now we had a recent publication out of Mecca in early 2024 saying that anyone who is not outside of the consensus of the unanimous consensus of Muslims is a Muslim. Well, that's a somewhat circular definition. And ijma is a very problematic concept, both conceptually and mathematically. And this is something I explored in my book, Who Are the Quranists, on the chapter is ijma shirk. And the answer is not necessarily, but it can be. It certainly can be. And this circular definition, so we've takfired you, so your opinion doesn't matter. So now we have this set of people we haven't takfired, and they agree, and so you're not a Muslim. But then if one of them, if one dissenter was orthodox enough not to be takfir, and they were willing to raise their hand and stand up for that minority position and say, well, that's an interpretation of the Quran, which might be wrong, but it should be acceptable. Then we find that, oh, well, okay, they're Muslims, so now this isn't ijma. So you see how the puzzle gets, the knot gets undone incrementally. And so the next step, I recently saw a rather conservative account tweeting a fatwa that Twelvers are not kafirs. Isn't that nice? Isn't that lovely? That's beautiful, because that is true. They are not kafirs, and they said that they might be they're sinning if they curse companions. It's fisk, but it's not kufr. And some people objected, and they said, "What about the verses in the Quran about the Ansar?" And it's a bit vague sets, but the Quran being having underspecified sets of vital importance to be either denigrated or lauded is a recurring problem in the hermeneutics of the Quran. And the brother said, even though I don't love his general perspective, this is the point, is that he is my brother in Islam. And I have him muted, but I saw those tweets and I was grateful for it. And so they lump them in with the Mutazilis, the Murjis, and the Abadis as deviant groups, deviant but not kuffar. And I'll take it. It made me feel great. It made me feel safe, even though that's actually all up to God. But it's such a relief, the mental pressure of constantly having this tension with the mainstream. And that makes it a lot easier for people who aren't as weird and hardcore as I am, or perhaps you, my fellow, to stay in this religion, because you don't have to be a polemicist. And I find conversely that the Quran, the Ahl Quran, these smaller groups We have a problem with takfiring each other. You've got Quran centric Farahis takfiring flat earth literalist Quranists who question everything, and they then in turn call them mushriks. You've got Brother Schweib saying if you accept some hadith, you're a munafiq, which is completely incorrect and an incredibly crude thing to say. We need better definitions of shirk in this sub movement, and we need to be more unified in this movement, and we need to be diplomatic about the majorities, the larger sects, and not be sects. The point is that this is another point of discourse in the Quranist communities. They say, well, we're not Quranists because that would be a sect. We don't necessarily agree on a lot of interpretations either. We're tolerant of that. That's why we're not a sect. Okay. You say it's haram to be a sect. But what the Quran says is to avoid those who make division, not those who are different. We're all different. The Quran also says if Allah had willed, we would all be one community of believers. But the truth is that, and this is what you really learn when you study all the varied interpretations in the Qurani interpretations that people have. It's a big blender of different tafsirs done by people of varying levels of study. And that is that not everybody is aware of their epistemology, but everybody has one. And thus we have this concept of a school of thought rather than a sect. Because the sect, through its epistemology, arrives at interpretations which segregate and therefore divide the religion, and thus can pronounce takfir on other Muslims based on their lack of appreciation of the isma of certain imams, or their lack of appreciation of the isma of sahabis, or their belief that the Quran is created or uncreated, and so on, things which are not specified. And this is indeed making division, and it is idolatry because you are taking something other than Allah and asserting it as a litmus test for submission to God, when really it's submission to that epistemology, subscription to it. Whereas if we think of these groups as following schools, then we find a more moderate understanding, inshallah. And this indeed happened with Baadism. Baadism used to be the most intolerant of puritanical Muslim sects. They weren't violent about it like their Khawarij antecedents, but they believed that all the other Muslims were going to hell, even if they were pretty good Muslims. Now they believe that sort of like a Pauline Christianity, if you're a Maturidi and then you do major sins and you think that maybe you'll go to hell, but you'll be bailed out with intercession, that you're mistaken, and that kind of thinking will actually land you in hell eternally. But nonetheless, if you're a good Maturidi, you can certainly make it to Jannah. And this is a revised position of the Oman of Sultan Qaboos in the late 20th century, in which many Sunnis and Shias came to work and live and do interfaith dialogue conferences and pray together in the same masjids and behind each other in Oman. And Oman has done very well, whereas Yemen, under the Zaydi rule in Sana'a, has not done very well. So it is very illustrative of how the Abadis are structurally more crusty, perhaps, uh, as if they believe in predestination. So it's as if they were predestined to become more liberal towards their fellow Muslims and have a more genteel, open society that holds on to its traditional roots. And mashallah. And then you would think, well, the Zaydi Usul is kind of one of the better ones. If you like some of the tenets of Shiism, you see that Ali is an essential heroic figure, not necessarily to a galul of being a divine pillar of the cosmos, but what he represents are virtues that help us to lens jihad, nifaq, and a better interpretation of the Quran, that we get away from hadith dogmatism that forms. and then you want to get away from some of the problems of Shiism, so you land on Zaydi. But then what's the Zaydi society? It's modern Sanaa, and I don't want to say that's a mashallah, because if you follow Mutazili Akida, you believe that there's a fairly decent degree of human choice, and indeed the Quran says that the good comes from Allah, but the evil comes from other humans, and this is the tragedy of Yemen today. And so it's difficult for Western interpreters to adapt Zaydiism into a cohesive institutional base. Whereas in a body like our my crusty brother in Islam, the Prima Quran blog, living in Singapore, has the pillar of the tradition and the libraries of the Abadis in Oman to rely on. But we lack this level of guidance from Zaydis. Rather, they're occupied with making oil spills off their coast and doing tits for tats with Israel, which, as we covered in the last episode, is a broken clock being right twice a day. That's a good thing they're doing. They've done a lot of other bad things, including impoverishing their own people, fighting their countrymen, and making division in religion, which is unforgivable shark. Can be outweighed by better actions, but they've certainly done a lot of evil. Now, on the other hand, the Mutazili tradition, which is somewhat analogous to this, doesn't even have to invest the level of isma that the Zaydis invest. And it allows for a rational critique of all human activities and a stronger philosophical tradition. And if you contemplate that the Mutazili tradition has been fragmented, and that theologically later contributors like Mullah Sadra and Ibn Arabi actually advanced that form of Aqidah, that form of theology, and that in fiqh we have things like the Farahi Madhab, which is more or less a Mutazili usul in its application. And in history we have the Orientalist adaptations of Islamic syncretism, such as the Freemasons from the Knights Templar and the Enlightenment and the United States of America and so on, which also have their own problems, obviously, just like the Ansar Allah. And maybe they're a little bit better on a net basis. But nonetheless, I believe that what happened with Europe would have happened with Persia if the Mutazilis were still the mainstream. And in this study, I came upon a book called Nirak al-Shia by Al-Hassan bin Musa al-Nazbakti. I may have misremembered and mispronounced that, but he wrote this heresiological study to all the subsects of early Shiism, and he's only critical of the Galul, and he maps out fairly well some of the other ones. And it's interesting that he notes this is written in the 800s. I'm not sure if it's the early 800s or the mid to late 800s, but so second century Hijra, early second century Hijra, or rather, sorry, early third century Hijra, that there are four main groups in Islam at the time: the Shia, the Khawarij, which he's probably glomming the Abadis under that label because of the distance and the bad memories, the Murjia, and the Mutazili. And I thought, well, isn't that interesting? Because there's no who are the proto Sunnis? There's no Sunnism in this mapping. This wasn't a concept that was codified in this time of the Abbasid Caliphate. So Sunnism is an invention of the reaction to Ahmad ibn Hanbal at some level. Obviously, there's other people involved, but it is a back projection. It is a retroactive continuity. And this is why you have hadiths of Abu Hanifa repenting against believing the Quran was created on his deathbed in prison, which I'm skeptical of. It's possible. People had access to him in prison. He gave lessons. He could have told them, "Oh, the Quran is uncreated." He certainly could have had that marifa, and that maybe even be the truth, and I might be wrong to believe it's created, but that but he has those hadiths outstanding, and so the question would be, well, which of those four groups were the proto-Sunnis? And I would say that it was the Murjia, because the Murjia were the Shia of Muawiyah, and they were the political quietists. And if you look at the way that Sunni states are dealing with Israel today, it's very much a Murjiite dynamic. And if you look at the way that Sunni Islam is taught on Dawa YouTube, it is actually a Murjia modus operandi, because all of the Salafi jihadists have brought horrible wars upon their countries, and it's no longer profitable for Saudi to fund them any longer. And so the roots prevail. Whereas the Zaydis are putting a cleft in the Achilles heel of the entire U.S. dollar world order by threatening this idea that the U.S. maritime power projection will protect world trade, and at great expense. They're not really doing very much else effectively, but that is one thing that they're doing very effectively. Whereas Hezbollah is threatening the social stability of Israel, but they aren't threatening the entire world order of the US dollar. So I have to give the Ansar Allah a little credit for that. And I think it's important that as we enter this dialogue of the unification of the Ummah and also the expansion of the Ummah through more converts, and inshallah that these converts can stay in the deen and they can find a home intellectually and spiritually, that we associate this Mutazili tradition with a continuity going back to the early days of Islam, that it is an authentic madhab that has just as much of a claim, a right to exist as any other, that we respect other Rasul, we don't make takfir of others, and that we update it. We're not beholden to the missives of people like Al-Nizam or other historical Mutazili of the Abbasid period, or proto-Mutazili of the late Umayyad period in Iraq. Rather, we can bring in all sorts of personae. So next time, inshallah, I will have more detailed nuance about what the Zaydi tradition has to bring. This one became more of a contemplation of madhabs in general, and where Zaydism fits in as an interesting nexus of the usul. So I wish you a blessed day.